It was August 15, 2019, and a large crowd gathered over by Flight of Fear, awaiting the announcement of the single biggest investment in Kings Island's history. Rumors of a Giga coaster coming to the park had been circling around for quite some time and even made its way into the major media outlets. Between the leaked documents and park teasers, it was all but confirmed that a new giant Giga coaster would be the park's next roller coaster. Well, the official ride trailer started to play, stating what everyone was speculating or basically already knew: Orion, a Giga coaster. After the trailer was played, the audience started to chant Giga in sheer excitement. Park officials said that they would be receiving a new Giga coaster from Bolliger Mabillard. Well, as the event started to wrap up, many realized that the park didn't actually say how tall this new roller coaster would be. From the announcement, we knew that Orion featured a 300-foot drop, 5,321 feet of track, and had a max speed of 91 miles per hour. But again, no mention of the height. During questioning, the park said that the ride is actually 287 feet, but with the use of the terrain, it is able to achieve that 300-foot drop. I think many thought this was an ingenious use of the land by the park, but as the night ended, the negative comments started to emerge. As various coaster enthusiasts released their analysis of this new attraction, I would say that the overall consensus was disappointment. Mostly because Orion wouldn't be the biggest Giga coaster that everyone wanted. Even I posted some concerning remarks that Orion wasn't the big coaster that we all hoped for, but noted that it should be a great ride regardless. Well, these negative comments started to feed many memes online, even prompting some new hilarious nicknames like Onion287. The legitimacy of Orion being a Giga coaster was now brought into question. The biggest claim was that the ride height didn't reach 300 feet, thus it cannot be called a Giga coaster. Well, that brings us to the whole point of this video. Is Orion a Giga coaster? Basically, there are two rules of thought on this matter, and depending on which one you select, will take you down some interesting rabbit holes. The first one is very simple. The ride structure must be 300 feet to be considered a Giga coaster. This sounds like a reasonable definition because if 300 feet and higher is what designates a Giga coaster, then yeah, it makes sense. Next, it's not about height, but the maximum drop. Again, sounds reasonable. A structure could be like 170 feet, but with the use of the terrain, pull off a 210-foot drop. You know, just like Apollo's chariot, and everyone considers that a hypercoaster. Before I get too far ahead of myself, let's go over a couple terms that are important to this video. A hypercoaster is a term coined by Cedar Point, which is part of the Cedar Fair chain. It is a classification of coasters that range in height from 200 feet to 299 feet. A Giga coaster, which is yet another term coined by Cedar Point, is a classification for roller coasters that stand 300 feet to 399 feet. Now that I clarified what a hypercoaster and a Giga coaster is, let's move on. So back to our two thoughts. Do we judge by the ride structure height or elevation change during the drop? Looking at the ride height and making our classification on this stat alone will bring about some problems. High Roller, which operated at Stratosphere Tower from 1996 to 2005, was 909 feet tall but was not termed the tallest coaster in the world, or at least not considered a record-breaking coaster on that term anyways. I mean, the roller coaster literally sat on top of a tower. The ride was super high in the air but featured no major drop, thus considering it a hyper or Giga coaster never even came up. Next, let's look at the other problem that arises with this thinking. Let's say Millennium Force over at Cedar Point. The ride is 310 feet tall and is considered to be the first ever Giga coaster. Well, what if Cedar Point for some random reason was working on terrain or scenery improvements, temporarily dumped a 15-foot pile of dirt right underneath the tallest point of the coaster? Would that mean a Millennium Force is now 290 feet tall and not a Giga coaster? No, well, maybe technically in some sort of weird term, but this is why I think the elevation change of the drop is so important. Phantom's Revenge at Kennywood is considered a hypercoaster, but that ride never breaks the 200-foot height mark. The ride uses the terrain, allowing it to pull off a 228-foot drop, so yeah, there is a large elevation change that gets it the classification of hypercoaster. Now, if we say that the drop is most important, it leaves us with one very awkward situation, and that's Magnum XL 200. This is the first ever hypercoaster and has a height of 205 feet. Well, the drop only reaches a little over 194 feet, so does that mean Magnum XL 200 isn't a hypercoaster? I think the biggest point that we continue to forget is that Cedar Point created both terms, so if they want to call Magnum XL 200 a hypercoaster or Millennium Force a giga coaster, they can. Coaster enthusiasts took these terms and started to make their own classifications. I know some even went as far to declare only certain types of coasters over 200 feet could be a hypercoaster, but in reality, it would apply to all coasters in that height bracket. Kings Island, which is owned by Cedar Fair, declared Orion a giga coaster, and they have that right. As far as I'm concerned, if it looks and acts like a giga coaster, well, it's a giga coaster. On that term though, does Orion act like a typical giga coaster? Well, sort of. Looking at other various giga coasters like Millennium Force, Fury 325, and Intimidator 305, they all put more emphasis on the speed. Orion has a lot of taller elements in its layout, meaning it's not keeping that high speed through most of the ride. It does have that speed hill, but so do other various hypercoasters. In a way, Orion is kind of like the best of both worlds. It has great elements that are found on hypercoasters, and also takes some great elements that we would find on a typical giga coaster. To wrap things up, Orion is a giga coaster because, number 1, the ride features a 300-foot drop. Number 2, the park calls it a giga coaster. Number 3, the ride features elements found on a giga coaster. And 4, the structure looks like a giga coaster. I didn't mention this one yet, but B&M has their own support design only found on the giga coaster models. Looking side by side, we can see the similarities with the supports between Fury 325 and Orion. So yeah, I think this finally clears it up. Orion is a giga coaster, but honestly, who cares? It's a great coaster regardless of the ride stats. I consider it to be a top 20 roller coaster. If there is one thing I've learned from Orion, you can't judge a coaster prior to riding it. Until next time, this is Extreme Thrills. For the longest time, roller coasters were split into two categories, wood or steel. Well, since 2010, this simple binary definition was put to the test when Rocky Mountain Construction introduced their first ever alleged hybrid roller coaster. In the next episode of Roller Coaster Philosophy, join me as we discover what is a hybrid roller coaster, and do they actually exist?